Here we go. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the next in our series of Tanner Humanities Fellows Works in Progress presentations. This afternoon we're joined by Professor Andrew Franta from the English Department at the University of Utah. He is teaching Romantic and 18th century literature. He is the author of Romanticism and the Rise of the Mass Public, published by Cambridge in 2007, articles on William Godwin, Jane Austen, Thomas de Quincey, and Percy Shelley, and Tobias Smollett. And most recently, he's published Systems Failures, the Uses of Disorder in English Literature, 1740 to 1850, with Johns Hopkins University Press. He received his PhD from Johns Hopkins, and he received his undergraduate degree from also my alma mater, University of Chicago, both in English. He's a member of many groups, including the MLA and specific groups on English Romantic literature, Romanticism in the 19th century and the 18th century, and also Restoration and early 18th century English. He's a very active scholar and has been a wonderful addition to our fellows community. We gather on Fridays, and it's always wonderful to see and hear from him. Today we're going to hear about Shelley form and figuration. I believe the paper was distributed to, actually just the fellows. So I've read it and think it's fabulous and learned a great deal. I'm sure he'll tell you about his work, and I'm turning the time over to Andrew. I will keep a queue of questions, both observing the chat as well as the hand raise function. So please keep the questions in mind until we conclude. And join me in welcoming Professor Franta.
Thanks, Erica. Thank you for your management of I guess the center and this fellowship for all of us. It's been terrific. Thanks to everyone for tuning in today. I really appreciate it. It's great to see so many of your names. Maybe we'll see. I'll see all of your faces a little later. I also wanted to thank the other Tanner Fellows, the other members, in addition to Erica, of the Friday Write Club, which has been incredibly helpful over the course of this year. Taylor Johnson, Hannah Young, and Natalia Washington. This is part of a new project on Romantic poetry and the idea of history. And it comes out of a graduate seminar I've been teaching for a few years on kind of the seminar work does to kind of double duty. Works as kind of an advanced introduction to Romantic poetry for our grad students. An introduction because some of them haven't ever read any of this stuff or read it a long time ago or only read a little bit of it, and an advanced introduction because one of the things that organized the course was a question about kind of the place of close reading, formal analysis of poetry in Romantic studies now. In the field, I've been struck recently by a kind of divide between theory and history, historicist approaches and kind of theoretical approaches. So in class, that's one of the things that we always had on the table. The thing that struck me about teaching the seminar, though, is how often we spend whole sessions, whole meetings, talking about a few weird figures, images, in the poems that we're reading. So that's kind of the genesis of the project and this talk. The talk's in three parts. The intro introduces the talk and kind of situates it a little bit in the larger project. The second section is about the place of form in recent debates about literary criticism and method. And then the third section really turns to Shelley, to some figures in Shelley, in The Triumph of Life, and one passage from Prometheus Unbound, to talk about what they have to say about literary form and literary history. And my title, yes, is Shelley Form and Figuration. Midway through The Triumph of Life, before I start, if the PowerPoint is not working for anyone, just start screaming, because I put it together, but that's no guarantee that it's going to work. Okay. Midway through The Triumph of Life, Percy Bysshe Shelley's poet narrator encounters a grim feature who identifies himself as what was once Rousseau. Mystified by the procession he has just witnessed, in which the allegorical figure Life drives on his many victims, the poet asks Rousseau about the meaning of his life. Whence camest thou, and whither goest thou? How did thy course begin, and why? Rousseau says that he cannot answer these questions. Instead, he turns them back on the poet, urging him to follow life's procession, so that what thou wouldst be taught, I then may learn from thee. I'll return to this encounter, as well as passages in The Triumph of Life and Prometheus Unbound that develop forms of poetic figuration that illuminate Shelley's conception of history and the possibility of historical change. For now, though, I want to focus on the logic of Rousseau's puzzling response. Rather than answering the poet's questions, Rousseau meets his plea for help with a request of his own. The response reverses the roles of student and teacher. What the poet would learn from him, Rousseau asks him to teach. The poet, it seems, must learn something from his experience that the philosopher has been unable to derive from his own. But it is one thing to say that you learn by teaching, and quite another to claim that you can't know until you teach. If the exchange looks like a Socratic dialogue in which the philosopher asks questions that challenge the student's beliefs and assumptions and stimulate critical thinking, Rousseau's response makes a mockery of the method. Rather than leading the poet toward greater understanding, the process of question and answer short circuits. This moment illustrates a puzzle that is at the heart of my new book project, Romanticism and the History of the Future. The Triumph of Life is populated by historical and allegorical figures: Rousseau, Socrates and Jesus, Plato, Voltaire, and Kant, as well as Catherine and Frederick the Great of Russia, and the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II all appear in the poem, as does the personified abstraction Life, whose triumph is a procession of the dead that represents the course of Western history. This is a Roman triumph. Shelley's deeper concern, however, is not particular historical personages or a principle of historical development, but a more abstract idea of history as a process. Rousseau's response to the poet of the Triumph suggests that historical knowledge is accessible only by moving forward in order to look back. And the poem ultimately intimates that the meaning of history emerges through a kind of perspective retrospection. This paradoxical claim about the temporality of history is an insight about how we come to understand our own place in history. It discloses a conception of history as a process of meaning making that critics of Romanticism and of historicism in general have tended to overlook. History, as Shelley understands it, is made through a process of recursion. His idea of history resembles a feedback loop. Time moves forward in a straight line. Historical understanding is the product of retrospection and reinterpretation. It depends not only on causes and effects, actions and reactions, but on reflections and reconsiderations that look back on the immediate or distant past and make it, in a sense, what it was. It is this view of history that prompted the Polish historian Leszek Kolakowski to remark that the past itself is nothing. In his eloquent formulation, the past by definition is an ocean of events that once happened, and it is only our present reconstruction of the past that is real, not the past as such. Understood in this way, history as we come to know it is the product of a recursive process that connects past and present rather than an immutable sequence of events. Shelley pushes this conception of history a step further, suggesting that historical actors operate in something like the future perfect tense. As in the statement, an hour from now, this Zoom meeting will have ended and we will be thinking about what to have for lunch. To make sense of history, we not only look back on past events, but project ourselves forward to imagine the history of our present as something that will have happened in an as yet unrealized future. I'll argue that moving forward to look back is the primary figural structure of the triumph of life and a key component of Shelley's poetics. In a broader sense, however, this kind of figuration extends well beyond Shelley's poetry. It exemplifies a powerful strain of thinking about history and historical change in early 19th century literature. Again and again, Romantic poets use familiar forms of literary figuration, including metaphor, irony, and allegory, to explore the temporality of meaning making. Poetry's indirection, especially the tendency of Romantic poetry to reflect on its own procedures, fosters the creation of open works, texts that call upon their readers not merely to consume them, but to participate in their making. This turn to the reader is in part a response to the emergence of the mass reading audience at the turn of the 19th century. Poets like Shelley, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Keats wrote poems for immediate audiences of family and friends, but also for readers that the burgeoning print public sphere assured them were out there, but about whom they knew very little and with whom they felt they had little in common. They wrote, moreover, without the confidence that their works would actually be read, let alone read as they intended. This problem is the basis for Wordsworth's famous claim that in addition to writing, every author, as far as he is great and at the same time original, has the task of creating the taste by which he is to be enjoyed. The idea that audiences must be made rather than found is at once a fascinating literary historical issue and a response to the demands of a historical moment of crisis that in many ways foreshadows our own. Romantic writers worked to envision and bring about a more perfect future, but they did so in the face of an intractable political divide between Whigs and Tories and a rapidly changing and frustratingly inscrutable public. Under this pressure, in the early 19th century, poetry became a crucial way of thinking about the dilemma of historical change, a philosophical and historical question that is as urgent today as it was then. Rethinking the practices that shape the making of history that is in the making of a history that is in the process of being written is a pressing political concern, especially in an era of media saturation and fake news. Romantic poetry does not offer an answer to this crisis, but it stands as a signal attempt to think seriously about alternative modes of history making. The promise and the curse of poetry's particular contribution to this new way of thinking about history is that it is not propositional. Poets like Wordsworth and Shelley, of course, had strong political views, but their ideas about politics and history are not reducible to statements about policy or programs. Instead, what's truly radical about this strain of Romanticism is that it transforms poetic form itself into a vehicle for thinking about history, politics, and social change. The claim that aesthetic judgment underwrites rational critical thought is broadly Kantian, and much work has been done to establish and to contest the Kantian inheritance of Romantic poetry. In focusing on poetic form, my aim is different. I will argue, for example, that Shelley's thematic treatment of history and the triumph of life is a context for a more searching examination of how we think about history. It is in the turns and twists affected by the poem's formal features that the triumph formulates its most powerful claims about the historical imagination. The challenge this project presents is that literary criticism's current understanding of form and its functions remains largely inadequate to the formal experimentation of Romantic poetry. Coming to grips with the complexity as well as the premises of Romantic formalism requires that we confront the limitations of our current debates about literary critical method. In the first part of this talk, I'll examine this critical problem. In the second, I'll argue that the form of figuration developed in Shelley's poetry represents an approach to form's role in reconceptualizing the relationship between literature and history that literary criticism has failed to understand. In the most recent issue of Critical Inquiry, Jonathan Kramnik notes that method has been a hot topic in literary studies as of late, and observes that Rita Felsky's 2014 term method wars for debates between various types of reading and quarrels over the status of critique seems to have stuck. The method wars are the sticky subject of Felsky's influential The Limits of Critique, which conducts a sustained polemic against the critical practice she names, borrowing a phrase from Paul Ricoeur, the hermeneutics of suspicion. Felsky argues that suspicion is a pervasive present as mood and method in literary criticism. and that Ricoeur's phrase captures a widespread sensibility and an immediately recognizable shape of thought. In place of suspicious reading, Felsky offers a mode of reading that is more responsive to what literary texts actually do: address their readers, attract and sustain their attention, and provoke new affective and intellectual experiences. Felsky's largest claim is that this approach to literary works can open the way to a renewed engagement with art and its entanglement with social life. Felsky's book is a manifesto, but also a sign of the times. It rehearses, for example, some of the imperatives of the method that Stephen Best and Sharon Marcus have called surface reading. Like Felsky, Best and Marcus reject the idea that literary criticism must be a mode of ideological demystification, and they recommend surface reading as a critical method capable of broadening the scope of critique to include the kinds of interpretive activity that seek to understand the complexity of literary surfaces that have been rendered invisible by symptomatic reading. Felsky's emphasis is more squarely on the affirmative and affective dimensions of literary reading. Her argument for post-critical reading is a call to reorient literary studies around the recognition, long overdue, of the text status as co-actor, as something that makes a difference, that helps make things happen. Rather than looking behind the text for its hidden causes, determining conditions, and noxious motives, Felsky argues, we might place ourselves in front of the text, reflecting on what it unfurls, calls forth, makes possible. There's a striking resonance between Felsky's language here and Shelley's description of a great poem as a fountain forever overflowing with the waters of wisdom and delight. After one person and one age has exhausted all its divine effluence, which their peculiar relations enable them to share, another and yet another succeeds, and new relations are ever developed, the source of an unforeseen and unconceived delight. Given this correspondence, it's notable that there's very little poetry in the limits of critique. In Felsky's argument about artistic appreciation and response, poems do not appear as objects of analysis or even as examples. For Felsky, art means novels, films, and works of visual art. Literature is fiction. The closest she comes to a consideration of form is a chapter on the detective novel, but her focus is on the material features of the genre: crime, clues, and criminals, and the resemblance between literary detectives and suspicious critics. For post-critical readers of literature, it appears what unfurls, calls forth, and makes possible is literature's content, the stories it tells, and especially the characters who populate them. This focus on fiction and fictional characters is a sign that post-critical reading, despite its emphasis on the differences that texts can make and what they help make happen, has very little interest in literary form. In a method that enjoins critics to pay closer attention to text, this indifference to form is surprising. Perhaps even more surprising is that post-critique shares this indifference with other recent critical movements that call for renewed attention to the text. Under various banners, the return to the text, to aesthetics, to form, over the last 25 years, a broad range of critics have argued that literary criticism has devolved into a practice of unmasking and demystifying texts by situating them within a seemingly endless series of cultural and historical contexts. In an essay titled "What is New Formalism?", Marjorie Levinson offered an assessment of the formalist quarrel with history that applies to much that applies as much to post-critical reading today as to the critical trends she surveyed in 2007. Levinson's main argument is that despite its advocacy rhetoric, new formalism does not advocate for any particular theory, method, or scholarly practice. In response to Susan Wolfson's claim that the return to form shows, if not consensus about what form means, covers, and implies, then a conviction of why it still has to matter, Levinson asks, what is a shared commitment minus articulated agreement about the object to which one commits? It is instructive that the lack of critical consensus Wolfson describes doesn't finally have anything to do with theory, method, or scholarly practice. Instead, she is characterizing how recent formalist criticism understands form itself, which in the end isn't remotely clear. That form means X to this critic and Y to that critic doesn't seem to make a difference so long as both critics are convinced that whatever form is and whatever it does, it still matters. This tendency to claim that form matters without demonstrating how it does the work it's imagined to do similarly plagues recent arguments about the inherently political and social nature of literary form. For Carolyn Levine, for example, form is the register in which artistic practice intersects with the work of social and political justice. Because cultural artifacts and political and social arrangements can all be subjected to formal analysis, form itself mediates between these seemingly separate realms. In readings of works ranging from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and sonnets by Elizabeth Barrett Browning to Antigone and the TV series The Wire, Levine argues that the correspondences between literary and social forms at once model and constitute political agency. Paying attention to literary form is thus, as Levine puts it, an attempt to think about how we might make our world more just. Along similar lines, Anna Kornblue argues that the 19th century novel participates in the same work of making as political action and social movements. Rather than the vehicle of ideological mystification that new historicist critics made it out to be, the Victorian novel is a formal mediation of social structure that itself constitutes a political act of world-making. And Kornblue adds, criticism should follow suit. What's missing from this work, as I've already suggested, is a clear sense of precisely how literary form or literary criticism contributes to these political projects. As strenuously as Levine and Kornblue, as well as Felsky and New Formalism, argue that New Historicism got it wrong in reading literary texts symptomatically or suspiciously, they all rely on the idea that the relationship between literature and the larger world is homological, which was, after all, the central premise of New Historicist methodology. Richard Stryer has described this view as the conviction that the formal features of a text, matters of style, can be indices to large intellectual and cultural matters. The question is how we should understand the operation of this indexical relationship. If we are convinced that literature's contribution to such large intellectual and cultural matters as political and social change amounts to more than what it says about politics and society, that how literature says what it says matters as much as what it says, then we must ask how literary form acts on readers and the world. This is the question that animates The Triumph of Life. The animations are in there so I can drink water. That some sort of historical progress is at stake in The Triumph of Life is clear enough. The poem's sources, metrical form, and narrative each register the idea of progress in its various senses, and to a large extent, Paul de Man's observation over 40 years ago that typical readings have focused on the debate as to whether The Triumph of Life represents or heralds a movement of growth or of degradation still holds true today. De Man influentially argued that the critical preoccupation with Shelley's attitude toward history was a mistake, that it obscured the poem's deeper concern with disfiguration, the endless process in which language demonstrates its performative power by enacting its own erasure, ultimately revealing the figurality of all signification. On this account, historical reference and literary self-reference are opposed. And The Triumph is an exemplary work because it stages this conflict by inviting us to mistake a literary text for a historical object. But de Man's polemical desire to claim self-reference and finally all figuration for literature alone misses the sense in which for Shelley, literary self-referentiality serves purposes that are not limited to literature. Instead of retreating into the prison house of language, The Triumph explores forms of figuration that envision attitudes toward history that are open-ended rather than renunciatory. figures that turn back on themselves, performing the kind of recursive movement that Rousseau recommends to the poem's narrator, ironically have much to say about the movement of history and the possibility of historical progress. Critics have long recognized the self-referential tendencies of Shelley's figures. In Seven Types of Ambiguity, William Empson turned to Shelley as an example of the ambiguity that results when the author is discovering his idea in the act of writing, or not holding it all in his mind at once, so that, for instance, there is a simile which applies to nothing exactly, but lies halfway between two things when the author is moving from one to another. He praises such figures in Shakespeare, and he cites lines from the Triumph as an example of the great things Shelley could do, even with so limited an instrument as the short-circuited comparison. And this is one of Empson's examples. And others mournfully within the gloom of their own shadow walked and called it death. Empson doesn't explain why these lines are great. We might guess that it has something to do with the way that walking not just in shadow, but within the gloom of their own shadow intensifies the mourner's desolation. In general, however, Empson regards this kind of self-inwoven simile as a defect of Shelley's poetry. They are a result of, when not being able to think of a comparison fast enough, he compares a thing to a vaguer or more abstract notion of itself, or points out that it is its own nature, or that it sustains itself by supporting itself. Shelley writes too fast, and in searching to find something to compare to the thing he's just described, his figures fail to keep up with the process of composition. Empson's central example of this fault in Shelley's poetry is Panthea's description of the earth as a multitudinous orb in Act 4 of Prometheus Unbound. And he cites the passage, the lines at the end that I've highlighted in gray. The full passage is much longer and more elaborate. Like to a child or wearied with sweet toil, the spirit of the earth is laid asleep, and you can see its little lips are moving amid the changing light of their own smiles, like one who talks of what he loves in dream. Empson's dismissive comment, the last comparison is merely a statement of what is, makes it clear that he regards Panthea's concluding image as simply circular rather than self-referential. The like of the passage's final line is redundant because it appears within the simile initiated by the phrase like to a child. The involution it affects is analogous to multiplying two negative numbers. The comparison is not redoubled. Instead, it undoes itself. The same passage is a focal point of one of the first reviews of Prometheus Unbound. In the October 1821 issue of the Quarterly Review, the Reverend William S. Walker wrote, "We have neither leisure nor room to develop all the absurdities here accumulated," and he's talking about the longer passage. "In defiance of common sense and even of grammar, whirlwind harmony, a solid sphere which is as many thousand spheres and contains 10,000 orbs or spheres, with inner transpicuous spaces between them, whirling over each other on 1,000 sightless, alias invisible axles, self-destroying swiftness, intelligible words and wild music kindled by the said sphere, which also grinds a bright brook into an azure mist of elemental subtlety, odor, music, and light kneaded into one aerial mass, and the sense drowned by it." Walker is even more direct elsewhere in the review. He remarks on Shelley's frequent and total want of meaning, and complains that in his descriptions, he never describes the thing directly, but transfers to it the properties of something which he conceives to resemble it by language which is to be taken partly in a metaphorical meaning and partly in no meaning at all. This objection is underscored by a quotation from Phaedrus's translation of Aesop's fables. "O quanta species et cerebrum non habet," a line that appears in the fable about a fox who gets into a theater storeroom and finds a tragic mask. After examining the mask closely, the fox exclaims, "Oh, what beauty! but no brains. What's odd about these objections to the brainlessness of Shelley's imagery is that the same passage has been singled out by many critics as a description of Shelley's poetry at its best. This is more than mere disagreement, that the same lines can be regarded on the one hand as the culmination of Shelley's most intellectually ambitious poem, and on the other, as a prime example of the failure of Shelley's poetry to mean anything at all, makes it an interpretive crux in the poem and in Shelley's poetry more broadly. From this standpoint, what's most instructive about Empson and Walker's criticisms is how they connect Shelley's total want of meaning to a particular class of figures. Both critics single out images whose retrograde motion troubles their forward progress and unsettles the relationship between literary language and its ostensible reference. But the passage from Prometheus Unbound also offers a different way of reading the convoluted figures that confound Empson and Walker. For her part, Ione finds a kind of irony in Panthea's image of the spirit of the earth's dream colloquy. Remarking on the figure, and this line appears immediately following the previous passage, she says, "'Tis only mocking the orb's harmony." Her response, unlike the critics' interpretations, attends to the passage's assertion of a whirlwind harmony made up of inward-turning relationships that are involved and involving orbs and made up of unimaginable shapes, each intertranspicuous. Where the critics find simple identity, Ione discovers a further compounded reflection of the orb's multiplicity. She suggests that Panthea mocks the orb's harmony by trying to capture it in language, but in so doing, she nevertheless manages to convey that it is something extraordinary. The self-reflexive figures of the Triumph of Life work along similar lines. Like the comparison of the movement of the little lips of the spirit of the earth amid the changing light of their own smiles to the movement of the lips of one who talks of what he loves in dream, many figures in the Triumph operate through a kind of self-comparison. In addition to the mourners who within the gloom of their own shadow walked and called it death, we encounter a chariot that appears on the silent storm of its own rushing splendor, and a shape all light who stood amid the sun as he amid the blaze of his own glory. That's the two middle passages there. In the first figure, the image of the chariot moving on its own rushing splendor suggests that rather than traveling over a pre-existing course, the road on which life's vehicle drives is of its own creation. In the second, while the full description of the shape all light suggests that it is a reflection of sunlight on water, the comparison of the shape standing within the sun's light to the sun standing amid the blaze of his own glory undoes the difference between the shape and the sun, casting them less as cause and effect than as two manifestations of one phenomenon. Rousseau does something similar later in the poem when he distinguishes his movement as he is swept up into the multitude following life's chariot from that of the phantom of that early form, which moved upon its motion. The identity of the early form is opaque. Perhaps it is Rousseau himself before his death. But its movement upon its motion, like the relationships between the chariot and the road or the shape and the sun, confuses any straightforward delineation of cause and effect or subject and object. The result is a form of figuration that frustrates our ability to identify vehicle and tenor, the literary critical terms for what is being compared to what, and instead offers the dynamism of the figure itself as its own frame of reference. Such figures resemble what classical rhetoricians called paraprosdokia, and contemporary linguists refer to as garden path sentences. Paraprosdokia means against expectation. Garden path sentences lead us astray. Both refer to statements that require reparsing to understand their meanings. In linguistics, the old man, the boat, the complex houses, married and single soldiers and their families, the horse raced past the barn fell, are common examples of garden path sentences. On first parsing, we misidentify parts of speech in such sentences. For example, taking old man as adjective and noun, and then on reparsing must correct our mistakes to arrive at the true sense. Old is a noun, man is a verb. Paraprosdokian often appear in the deadpan puns of comedians. Stephen Wright's joke, "On the other hand, you have different fingers," is an excellent example of the genre. These sentences are odd and sometimes funny, but the cognitive dissonance they produce is not unusual. Instead, it highlights the role that recursion plays in how we understand many linguistic utterances. Shelley's involuted figures also work against our expectations, and in so doing, they underscore the centrality of retrospection to understanding. In this sense, Rousseau's puzzling response to the poet of the Triumph of Life reveals the narrative logic of the poem's self-inwoven figures. When Rousseau insists that the poet teach what he wants to learn, he suggests that actors move through history following the same forward and back pattern of the poem's figures. But follow thou, this is Rousseau to the poet, and from spectator turn, actor or victim in this wretchedness, and what thou wouldst be taught, I then may learn from thee. Rousseau's reply to the poet not only reverses their positions, it upends our expectations about the relationships between followers and leaders, actors and victims. The idea that poems have a particular power to reach into the future is a recurrent theme of Shelley's poetry, from Queen Mab to the Triumph of Life. It is the basis for the claim in the defense of poetry that poets are the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, and the unacknowledged legislators of the world. In the Triumph of Life, this conception of futurity assumes a characteristic figural form. The forward and back movement of Shelley's figures captures the special purchase that poetry has on the future and on his version of historicism. As Rousseau's response to the poet of the Triumph dramatizes, in life it is impossible to move forward in time and look back on the present while remaining in the present all the while. Time runs in one direction only. But the time of reading is different, and the text makes the kind of perspective retrospection that Shelley envisions a reality. We can read to the end of a sentence and return to the beginning to make sense of what it means. Shelley's poetry inscribes this kind of retrospection at the level of form. Like Rousseau, the text responds to the questions we put to it with demands of its own. If we want to understand Shelley's images, we must take what we learn from their unfolding and go back and see them anew. Rather than telling the reader where to look for elucidation, the text recasts itself as the context for its own reading, not in order to rule out what we bring to it, but to emphasize the sense in which it is continually in the process of being reconstituted by the act of reading. Shelley's figures thus engender a practice of reading that not only makes poetic form a vehicle for critical thought, but models a habit of retrospection in the present. Moving forward and back, reinterpreting the sad pageantry of the Triumph of Life, or rereading the text are not impositions of method or system. They are what it means to read the poem. The poem is a process that includes its reading, a retuning of the hermeneutic circle that widens and refines not only how we understand literary form, but what our engagement with form teaches us about how history is made. Shelley is often regarded as an idealist or utopian thinker, but in approaching the present in terms of its relation to the future and the past, his appeal to futurity is less idealist or utopian than historicist. Rather than a static monument or the unfolding of a bare series of events, history is also a recursive process. Like poetry, its form is constituted by acts of reading. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. Well, we now have 20 minutes remaining for questions. Um, I will keep the queue, as I mentioned. I'm not seeing anything quite yet in the chat, but you also have your little blue hand that you can raise if you go to participants. I think that's how you would do that. So, questions from the audience? Otherwise, observations. Okay, I see Scott Black first. So let's proceed with Scott.
Hey, Andy, nice to see you. That was great. I really enjoyed it. I want to ask you, and I think your paper leads here, but I want to ask you to sort of tie up one end. I enjoyed your reading of the figures a lot, and I'm very interested in this retrospective notion of historicism. Could you just tie it back to the Felsky method wars? What does this mode of reading do for literary history, or for the way that we do literary history as a method? We're no longer reading directly in that realist fashion from text to history, but how does this relate to history? Or I should say, how does this relate to how we do historicism now?
Right. I guess the first thing to say is that it's just a simple recognition that a lot of texts are thinking about history. First of all, I mean, this isn't like this isn't finally an argument about method, at least not insofar as it's like immediately transportable to another kind of moment or set of texts. Although I think that the stuff that I'm talking about is not historically bounded. I think that it manifests itself in different ways at different moments. I think that's one of the things that Shelley is interested in. Going back though to the kind of method wars, I think that there's an odd tendency, and not just in Felsky, but and maybe not even primarily in Felsky, but in a lot of kind of contributions to these wars, and it's certainly the case in Romantic studies that there's a kind of that there's a kind of sense in which critics are presented with, kind of theoretical or formalist approaches and historicist approaches, and that those two are presented as like alternatives, a choice that has to be made, and so you do get kind of arguments on either side. Maybe especially on the kind of formalist side, that want to jettison history altogether. And I guess that from that standpoint, this kind of like more fine-grained consideration of the way that these issues are the way that Shelley, for example, but a lot of other writers too, are thinking through these issues, suggests that divide is entirely artificial, and that presenting the problem in terms of an argument about method is, from the standpoint of literary criticism, kind of wrong-headed, if we're going to be attentive to texts and what we're doing. Then those methodological questions to some extent kind of fall by the wayside. So in that sense, I would say that what I'm arguing against is that kind of artificial separation, or that kind of really the methodological claim, the claim that that's made, kind of in a way that suggests that it's added to or derived from, but in either case separate from what's happening in these literary texts.
I'm not sure how one intervenes in this conversation.
You just unmute yourself.
Okay. All right. I loved your emphasis and what you were doing with this. It seemed to me like the element of form you were focusing on was particularly syntax. And I sort of wondered if there were other elements, for example, the stanzaic form of triumph of life, if you could say a little bit more about how other elements of form are enacting the kind of processes you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that I just kind of gestured to in just mentioning in passing that the triumph of life is concerned with progress in its many forms. Well, one of those forms is like just the form of the Roman triumph, which was a progress or a procession. But several others are explicitly tied to, to stanzaic form, for example, in that the Terza Rima stanza that Shelley is working in here, that he uses in the Ode to the West Wind as well, is a structural kind of, it's an inheritance from Dante and from Petrarch, and it's also a kind of structural allusion. It's one that also contains within it a reflection on the idea of the progress or progress as Shelley is using it, insofar as that kind of interlocking, rhyme scheme, that kind of propulsive, stanzaic form, serve multiple purposes for him. And I think that the idea that that Shelley is like repurposing these forms is important. It's not simply a matter of kind of influence or intertextuality, although it is those things. There's also a sense in which Shelley imagines, and imagines kind of explicitly in various places, that he is in, his poetry is inhabited by these forms, that his poetry is continuous with these forms. And I think that continuity, he basically makes the argument in the defense of poetry that that kind of literary historical continuity, understood by Shelley, in many perverse ways, right? So like Dante and Milton are like, only incidentally Christian poets for Shelley, right? Is part of the special kind of, or is part of the way that poetry and poetic form looks like a vehicle for kind of occupying this future moment, or assuming a kind of future perspective, right? That's an assumption that these some of these works will endure, right? Even when they don't necessarily, they will endure. Never, like, you can read Shelley, you can read the Ode to the West Wind, or you can read the Triumph of Life without having read Dante or knowing anything about Dante, right? But these works are, they represent Dante's kind of continued life, even when the kind of history isn't present to a particular reader.
Okay, I think I'm off mute, and apparently I was on mute when I was calling on people earlier, so my apologies. There was a queue and Nadia was next in it. I also see Jeremy's hand, and I want to be mindful of time because we are at a 10-minute mark, and Howard's. I don't generally like to do this, but Andrew, would you be all right with me collecting the questions, having them be posed, and then having you respond, so that at least we can have them all?
Sure, yeah. Okay. I can also just give yes or no answers.
No, you're not allowed, against the rule. First, Nadia.
Actually, I'm set up for a yes and no answer, Andy, so you can choose to do that for mine.
Okay.
So there were a couple places in the talk where it sounded like you were eliding history and progress. And I wondered if that was intentional, and if so, is that you or is that Shelley? So that could just be a couple of yes, no, no's,
yeah.
But I pose that to you as the
no.
in the room.
And next we have
okay.
Rosen, and then Howard.
Yeah, I'll try to ask this quickly. I guess it's a little bit of a jumping off from Scott's question, or I had a sort of similar train of thought. Andy, it makes sense that the method wars often view form and historicism as sort of oppositions. You have to do one or the other. But it seems like it's also at times a debate about like the way we conceive of the work literature does. And is literature a sort of vehicle for either doing history or doing or doing a certain kind of political work? And so I'm wondering if these formal figures are, in your mind, a way of doing history, or are they doing something that's not history, that is something more particular to what literature does, even if it has historical concerns, if that makes sense.
Interesting, interesting. And Howard. Oh, you're also on mute. You're on mute. You're doing what I do. Yeah.
Thank you. So I won't repeat, Andy, my initial comment, which is thank you for that terrific talk. So I want to ask kind of the opposite version of Naj's question, which is, first, I really appreciated your debunking of what I always have thought are specious distinctions between formal analysis and historical analysis. And as I ask this question, I actually mean it as a compliment, but the question could be regarded as a challenging question. I don't mean it that way. History in your form, as you present it, can operate at the level of syntax, at the level of the figure, and perhaps even at the level of, traditional poetic forms, which is to say that there's something tautological about your definition of form. It is what poets engage in and what readers engage in at the same time. Likewise for history. History, as you define it, or through Shelley, is a recursive process. And what's important about history, as you're defining it, is the process by which people understand it and then make new history. And therefore, while content in a way is always relevant, the particulars of content are not relevant. Now, I asked the question, so Naj's version of that question is, are either you or Shelley perhaps eliding history because content may not be crucial to the historical process? I actually just want to compliment you for doing that.
All right, thank you. We still have a moment left for you to respond. And I also want to point to Craig Dworkin's question in the chat. So just take a look at that as well. It's also pointing you towards arguments about form
Right.
and syntax. So
let me answer Craig's question first, because I'm thinking about that, but I don't have anything to say yet, which is to say that Nersessian's book on calamity form is on my desk, but I haven't digested it. So it is, though, it does point, though, to kind of like, I think, broader interest in these questions, because I think that her kind of thinking about form and the questions it raises about kind of the relationship between, kind of form and content, especially historical content, are absolutely relevant to the questions that I'm asking. So that's a non-answer. I can answer Nadia's question. I'll go back to the beginning. This is Shelley. It's really Shelley, but it's something that I'm aware of and that I'm trying to work through, because I find myself, well, and coming around in a certain sense to Howard's question, I find myself using history and form both as these incredibly, kind of mutable, labile labels, right? So sometimes history means like history, like things that happen. This is something that we talked about in the kind of fellows work in progress meeting. History as a kind of, series of events. History as a kind of idea of history, or kind of almost a kind of idea of like historiography, right? Or, you know, not necessarily kind of the writing of history, but the kind of conceptualization of history. For Shelley, this is absolutely bound up with the possibility of progress, you know, social progress, but, you know, political progress. And so, you know, to some extent, in this case, this, I think is a not unfair reflection of kind of Shelley's thinking, but there are definitely strands here that need to be kind of pulled apart. I mean, and I think about it on a kind of analogy with the way that Shelley uses the term form. I mean, when Shelley talks about form, like in the Defense of Poetry, form is just like not content, you know, and beyond that, it can be a lot of things. And that's one of the difficulties, I think, that's one of the things, Howard, I think that you are pointing to, and it's something that, again, I'm kind of trying to think through, because really, you know, at various points in the paper, I think I even suggest like, well, I'm going to give an account of form. I'm going to give a better account of form. I don't do that, nor do I, you know, nor is that my aim. It's really, you know, when it comes to talking about form, it's a matter of addressing kind of you know, specifics. You know, I can talk about the kind of formal operation of syntax in these lines, or some of the kind of formal implications of other, you know, kind of artistic poetic choices that Shelley makes. But that doesn't arrive at, you know, kind of theoretical account of literary form, which, you know, I've read enough, like I'm steeped enough in Demant to think is kind of like a dead end, you know, in the sense that you just kind of get to the same place over and over again. Jeremy, literature as a way of doing history. I think what I'm talking about is like, you know, not even necessarily, I'm focusing on the way that in, at least in Shelley's handling of these questions about history, in The Triumph of Life and elsewhere, literature becomes a particular way of thinking about these kind of historical questions. And they do have to do not just with, you know, kind of like history imagined abstractly as process, but also with the intersection between that kind of like abstract understanding of process and actual history. You know, it's important that actual historical figures appear in The Triumph of Life. That's a difference from like Prometheus Unbound, where you get kind of thinking about similar, you know, kind of dynamics with really just like, I guess mythological figures or historical figures in some sense, but not in the way that like, you know, Plato or, you know, Leopold II were. But I don't know that I wouldn't claim that this is a kind of, it might be a specifically literary way of thinking about history, or maybe a particularly kind of poetic rendering of a set of kind of historical questions. But I wouldn't say that it's, you know, kind of uniquely literary. I think that especially for Shelley, poetry represents a particular and particularly powerful way of thinking about the future, you know, in relation to present and past, thinking about the future not as a kind of apocalyptic endpoint, or, you know, a future, a kind of, you know, a totalizing perspective that can be you know, kind of imagined or inhabited and inflicted on the present or the past. but instead, as you know, the poet present, past, and future sees. I mean, poetry has this kind of temporal, you know, these temporal modalities that are particularly useful in thinking about these questions that were for Shelley, and not just for Shelley, for, you know, for many others in this moment, that were context specific, you know, that had to do with a kind of, you know, understanding of a particular set of kind of political and you know, social problems that seemed, you know, intractable and resistant to thought, you know, really as a kind of as much as anything else. This is kind of nice because, like, because everyone's muted, I can just assume that I've answered all the questions, you know, satisfactorily.
Okay. Well, there are more comments in the chat, but let's see. I think that is our time, however. So for those of you with us, please join me in thanking and congratulating Andrew for the progress on this work. I've learned a tremendous amount. I particularly like the garden path sentence imagery and the making of own audiences, and really history and story and fact being almost a team sport. Like, if we are believing what it is we imagine about our future history and past. So very timely, very important, and also very enjoyable. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you at our next work in progress, which will be by Hannah Young, who is with us and will be presenting in April. So watch your inboxes for that. Also a spectacular project on secrecy. So stay tuned, and thank you so much.